In the last lesson, we looked at the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland as endocrine organs. Today, we're going to have a look at some of the other endocrine organs and glands found around the body. So, to start off, the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is often described as a butterfly gland, and as you can see with my yellow highlighter now, I'm showing you the rough outline of this thyroid gland here. It is located just below the larynx, and we can see the cartilage with the larynx in the diagram on the right. It is really important in a Year 12 level for the release of two hormones. These are thyroxine and calcitonin. There is another hormone as well. So thyroxine is often referred to as T4. There is one other hormone known as triiodothyronine, but we're not going to go into that in too much detail right now. When we talk about thyroxine, so again, sometimes known shorthand as T4, thyroxine is really important because it works on all of your body cells. And its job is to release energy to maintain your body temperature. So we know heat is released constantly in response or as a part of the process of cellular respiration, where glucose and oxygen are mixed together and used to create a new compound called ADP or ATP. Now, how this works again is it releases this energy by increasing the rate at which cellular respiration occurs. The release of thyroxine itself has a few key steps. Thyroxine is released by the thyroid gland, but the thyroid gland is under the control of the anterior pituitary gland, and the anterior pituitary gland is under the control of the hypothalamus. So if we start right at the top now, and I'll use yellow as the hypothalamus is in yellow on my diagram on the right, everything starts when there is a low level of thyroxine or a low body temperature, and that is detected by the hypothalamus itself. In response to these low levels of thyroxine or low body temperature, the hypothalamus will release thyroid stimulating hormone releasing factor, or TSHRF. TSHRF is what is going to travel down into the anterior pituitary, and it's going to travel through the blood vessels of the infundibulum to make it there to that anterior pituitary. Once in the anterior pituitary, it tells this endocrine gland to start releasing thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to travel through the blood to a thyroid gland, and eventually when it makes it to the thyroid, it is going to tell the thyroid to release thyroxine. And as we mentioned on our previous slide, thyroxine is going to travel through the blood to all body cells, and it's going to tell all these body cells to increase their rate of cellular respiration, so increase that metabolic rate. The next hormone that we're going to talk about released by the thyroid gland is calcitonin. Now, calcitonin is stimulated by high blood calcium levels, and what it does is it wants to decrease those blood calcium levels, and it can do this in three key ways. Number one, it can tell the kidney to decrease its reabsorption from the filtrate. It can tell bone to inhibit osteoclast activity, which is going to decrease bone breakdown. And lastly, it can tell the small intestines to stop absorbing as much calcium. And next hormones released by the parathyroid glands are these little glands found on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. So we can see the front of the thyroid gland. If I try and highlight it in green here, we can see the butterfly wings extending over onto the posterior surface, but in yellow you can see hopefully that I've highlighted those parathyroid glands. Now there are 4 parathyroid glands found in the human body, and they produce and secrete parathyroid hormone. So, what does parathyroid hormone do? Well, it's the opposite to calcitonin released by the thyroid gland. So parathyroid hormone is released due to low calcium levels found in the blood. And it works in 3 particular ways to increase those blood calcium levels. So firstly, in the kidneys, it increases calcium reabsorption from the filtrate. Number 2, in the intestines, it increases the amount of calcium absorbed into the body. And lastly, in the bones, it's going to increase how much calcium is released into the blood. So, the next endocrine gland is also an exocrine gland. Very similar to the not similar to the hypothalamus, sorry, but the pancreas itself is a series of special cells, okay? And in the pancreas, these special cells are known as the islets of Langerhans. And there are two particular types of islets of Langerhans. They are the alpha and beta cells. Now, as the pancreas is both an exocrine and endocrine gland, we are not going to be talking about the exocrine feature here. The exocrine feature of the pancreas is much more to do with the pancreatic juice, and this is important last year in year 11. What we are going to look at today is this endocrine feature, and this endocrine feature is really important in the control of blood glucose levels, thanks to two particular hormones. The first hormone, insulin, is what helps to increase blood glucose levels, is released in response to high blood glucose levels. And the particular cells involved of the release of insulin are beta cells. Their job is to try and decrease that blood glucose level, and how they do this is largely by trying to increase the amount of glucose taken in by body cells. Now, you can do this in a few different ways. The first way it can do this is by a process known as glycogenesis. Glycogenesis is where glucose is converted into glycogen in the liver and skeletal muscle. Secondly, in a process known as lipogenesis, glucose is stored in the body as fat, and again, that is stored in the liver. And this time, instead of in the muscle, this is stored in the form of adipose or fat tissue. Finally, glucose can be important in protein synthesis and can provide energy to store energy in the form of larger proteins. The next hormone, glucagon, has the opposite effect. So, glucagon is released due to a decrease in blood glucose levels, and instead of beta cells, glucagon is released by alpha cells. Its response, increase blood glucose. And it does this thanks to two other processes. These processes are named glycogenolysis, which is where glycogen is broken down into glucose, and this, again, same as glycogenesis, occurs in the liver and skeletal muscle, where it was stored earlier. And lastly, gluconeogenesis, where lipids, so fatty tissue, and amino acids, the building blocks of protein, are converted into glucose. And this again occurs in the liver and fatty tissue. Moving on down, we're going to skip over blood glucose and insulin for now to talk about the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are made up of two key structures. The first structure is what is known as the adrenal medulla, and the adrenal medulla is found inside this adrenal gland. And this adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla, is responsible for releasing adrenaline and noradrenaline. They do have different functions, these two hormones. They are very similar, and so in year 12 we largely group them together. The second component of the adrenal gland is known as the adrenal cortex, and it is all of this structure surrounding the adrenal medulla. Now, the adrenal cortex produces a wide variety of steroid hormones, but there are a few of particular note to us. And the two that we really care about is aldosterone and cortisol. So, aldosterone. We will talk about this a little bit later on in the year as well, but for now, our basic understanding of aldosterone is this. It is secreted when the adrenal cortex, or by the adrenal cortex, in response to high blood potassium ions, or inversely, low blood sodium ion level. And this may also be released due to a decrease in blood volume or a decrease in blood pressure. Now, aldosterone itself acts on the kidneys, and more specifically, the functional unit of the kidney known as the nephron. It does this by increasing the reabsorption of sodium ions from the filtrates of the blood and increasing the secretion of potassium from blood to filtrate. On the other hand, our next hormone is cortisol, and cortisol is released when the hypothalamus detects long-term stress. In response to this, the hypothalamus releases a hormone known as ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, and cortisol is released by this adrenal cortex, so this part that we highlighted in green earlier, when ACTH triggers it. When the hypothalamus sends this message from ACTH, travels through the blood to the adrenal cortex, and it is here that cortisol is released. So what does cortisol do? It helps the body to withstand stress, and it helps aid in the repair of damaged tissues. It helps us to regulate our metabolism by increasing blood glucose levels by two of the processes that we named earlier, glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. When we talk about the adrenal medulla, on the other hand, we're talking again about this yellow area in the center of the adrenal gland. Now, the adrenal medulla is not innervated by a hormonal response, but it is innervated by a neural response. So, when the hypothalamus detects stress, it's going to send a message via the sympathetic nervous system, something that we will talk about when we get to the nervous system later in the year, and it triggers the release of both hormones. What adrenaline and noradrenaline do, largely we're grouping their function together here, is that they help the body prepare for short-term stress. So this is most commonly thought of as the fight or flight response. So what is this fight or flight response? Well, imagine you're being chased by a bear. Okay, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, your liver is going to convert more of that stored energy into glucose so that your muscles, your skeletal muscles have lots of energy available. You might even wet yourself, okay? The bladder relaxes during this time and your pupils dilate so that you're more aware. And these are just a few of the key functions of adrenaline and noradrenaline in this short-term fight or flight response.